They call it the third eye, a gift, a hereditary blessing that elevates my kind above the common muck of humanity, seating us in gilded spires and draping us in robes of impossible wealth. The Navis Nobilite, they whisper the sanctioned mutant, the helmsman of the stars, the key to the Imperium's very existence. They are not wrong, but their understanding is a child's drawing of a supernova. They see the light, the power, the privilege. They cannot comprehend the fire, the annihilation, the soul-crushing gravity of the truth. This eye is not a gift. It is a wound. An unhealing, unblinking lesion in the soul bored through the bone of my skull and the flesh of my mind, exposing me to an ocean of impossibilities from which there is no respite. I am old now. My body is a withered thing more sustained by the arcane technologies of my stasis chamber than by any vital spark of its own. My two mundane eyes are milky with cataracts, seeing only shadows in this opulent sanctum. But the other eye is as sharp and clear as the day it was ripped open. It has never once closed. It cannot. I remember that day. The memory is not a faded tapestry like those that hang on these walls, depicting the glorious deeds of my gene sires. It is a fresh incision bleeding eternally in the core of my being. Before the ritual, the universe was a simple place. It was vast, yes, cold and uncaring, dotted with the billion lights of terror's domain. It was governed by physics, by cause and effect, by the reassuringly solid principles of reality. The warp, as I had been taught, was merely the medium of travel, a necessary shortcut through the cosmos, a turbulent but ultimately navigable sea. My tutors, ancient and desiccated navigators themselves, spoke of it in hushed technical terms. They taught me the star charts, the psychic currents, the litanies of binding the catechisms of passage. They prepared me to be a captain of a ship sailing a treacherous ocean. They did not prepare me for the truth that we are not sailors, but microbes clinging to a fleck of driftwood in a hurricane of pure, malevolent consciousness. The luxury of my house, the house of Taliesin, was a carefully constructed lie. The air, thick with the scent of spiced incense from a dozen extinct worlds, was meant to soothe. The silent gene-sculpted servants, anticipating every need, were meant to provide comfort. The vaulted ceilings painted with star charts that mimicked the celestial sphere were meant to inspire a sense of order and control. It was all a facade, a gilded cage built to insulate us from the truth that our very existence was predicated on a constant, intimate communion with hell. For the teeming, unwashed trillions of the Imperium, the warp is a story told to frighten children, a paragraph in the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer about the dangers of the void. It is an abstract terror, a distant theoretical enemy. They pray to the God Emperor on his golden throne to shield them from its influence, and their prayers are answered by kilometers of adamantium hull and the flickering energy of a Geller field. They live and die in blissful, utter ignorance. For us, for the Navigator, there is no such shield. The Geller field is a membrane, not a wall. It holds back the ocean, yes, but we can feel the pressure of the depths against it. We can see the leviathans that swim in that abyss, their forms made of frozen screams and boiling hatred. We can hear the songs of the sirens' promises of power and ecstasy whispered directly into the soul. We are the ones who must stare into that abyss voluntarily for the duration of every voyage. We are the lighthouse keepers on a shore of madness, and the light we seek is itself a beacon of cosmic agony. My first glimpse was not of demons, not of the clawed and fanged monstrosities that lesser minds imagine. What I saw when my warp eye tore itself open in that ritual chamber was far worse. It was the raw, unfiltered essence of unreality. It was color that was also pain. It was sound that was also memory. It was the crushing weight of a billion alien thoughts pressing in on me, each one filled with a unique and specific loathing for the very concept of my existence. It was a sea of pure emotion, where tides of rage crashed against shores of despair and whirlpools of lust dragged souls down into suffocating depths. In that single eternal moment, the child I was died. The simple universe of cause and effect was burned away, replaced by a new, terrifying reality, where belief could curdle the very fabric of space, and a forgotten god's dream could manifest as a star-eating horror. The patriarchs of my house, their own third eyes hidden behind jeweled lenses and tattooed lids, watched me writhe on the cold floor of the chamber. They did not offer comfort. They offered only a single cold acknowledgement. I had survived. I was now one of them. I was no longer a person but a tool, a precious, irreplaceable component in the great machine of the Imperium. A living astrolabe, a compass whose needle was my own sanity. My privilege was my curse, my sight was my damnation. And from that day forward, my every waking moment and every sleeping one would be spent with one eye fixed upon the material world and the other the true eye staring into the roaring, kaleidoscopic heart of hell itself. The eye that does not and will not ever blink. Our very essence is a paradox, a sanctioned heresy codified into imperial law millennia ago during the shadowed genesis of the Great Crusade. The Navigator gene, the mutatio navis, is what defines us. It is a stable, predictable, and utterly necessary deviation from the sacred human form. Without it, the Imperium would be a handful of star systems, blind and isolated, easy prey for the horrors that fester in the dark. With it, we knit the million worlds of mankind together, tracing the insane pathways of the Empyrean. This sanction grants us our station, our incalculable wealth, and our political autonomy. The great houses of the Navis Nobilitae are powers unto themselves older than most space marine chapters, wealthier than entire planetary dynasties. We trade our sight for thrones, our souls for monopolies on the star lanes. On paper, we are nobility. In person, we are monsters. Do not be fooled by the genuflections of a ship's captain or the flowery address of a rogue trader. I have seen it my entire life. I see the way their eyes linger on the unnatural smoothness of our skin or the slightly elongated cast of our limbs. I see the faint, almost imperceptible flinch when we turn our gaze upon them, even with our mundane eyes. They need us. They fear us. And in the deepest, most honest corners of their hearts, they despise us. We are the mutant at the high table, the aberration they are forced to toast. I have felt the subtle shift in a room's atmosphere when I enter the way conversation becomes just a little more stilted, a little more guarded. They look upon us and see a perversion of the holy human form, a reminder that the taint of change can strike even the highest echelons. They whisper the word mutant like a curse when they think we cannot hear, forgetting that our senses even before the opening are honed to a razor's edge. This is the foundation of our existence, to be simultaneously worshipped as saviors and loathed as abominations. Our wealth is the price of their revulsion, a gilded cage built from their reluctant necessity. My childhood was not a time of laughter and sunlight. It was a long, silent apprenticeship in a shadowy world. We, the scions of the great houses, are raised not as children, but as investments. From my earliest memories, I was sequestered away in the cloistered halls of the Navigator's quarter on Terror itself, a spire of such antiquity that its lower levels were lost in the planet's forgotten geological strata. The outside world was a rumor, a flickering image on a pict screen. My playmates were not other children, but holographic star charts that swirled around me in the dark. My tutors were grim-faced elders of my house, their own third eyes sealed beneath intricately carved golden lids. They did not teach me history as others learn it with tales of glorious battles and noble heroes. They taught me the history of warp currents, the genealogies of forgotten psychic entities, the precise ritual gestures required to placate a Gellerfield's machine spirit. They taught me to see a star map not as a collection of points, but as a living entity, its roots arteries of relative safety in a body of pure cancer. We were constantly reminded of our duty, a word that was always spoken with the gravity of a death sentence. It was our high and noble purpose to guide humanity. But the tone was never one of honor. It was one of grim, unavoidable sacrifice. We were isolated from normal human interaction, taught that such connections were a weakness, a contamination that could cloud the clarity needed to perceive the sea of souls. We were taught to be detached, aloof, to view the crews of the ships we would one day guide as little more than cargo, their lives a secondary concern to the successful completion of the voyage. They were instilling in us a necessary callousness, for to feel the terror of every soul aboard a vessel as it plunged into hell would be to invite madness instantly. We were living tools being sharpened for a terrible singular purpose. This cold, calculated upbringing was compounded by the suffocating pressure of bloodline. Within the Navi's nobilite, genetics is not a science, it is a religion. Our marriages are not matters of the heart, but strategic alliances meticulously planned by the patriarchs and matriarchs to consolidate power and, most importantly, to purify and strengthen the Navigator gene. I knew the name of my intended consort before I knew how to read a mundane book. She was a daughter of the House Benetech, chosen for the potency of her lineage, and a recessive gene that promised a strong resistance to certain empiric corruptions. We were breeding stock valued for the integrity of our DNA. Any flaw, any sign of physical weakness, or, emperor forbid, an unstable mutation was cause for immediate and permanent censure. I remember my cousin Lyra. Her warp eye opened incorrectly during her ritual. It saw things wrongly, seeing patterns of beauty in the chaos, hearing whispers of welcome in the psychic maelstrom. She was not healed. She was not helped. She was simply gone. The official story was that she had been granted an early retirement to a peaceful estate world. We all knew she had been purged, her genetic flaw erased from the family line, with ruthless efficiency. This was the ultimate terror of our gilded cage. It was not just the outside world that was a threat. The greatest danger often came from within, from the very family that claimed to cherish you, who would sacrifice you in a cold instant to protect the sanctity of the blood. The day of my own opening arrived not with pomp and circumstance, but with a chilling, sterile silence. The ritual chamber was deep in the heart of our spire, a place of bare, black stone that seemed to drink the light. The air was cold, tasting of ozone from the humming psychic resonators and the bitter metallic tang of concentrated incense. The walls were not bare. They were carved floor to ceiling with symbols I had studied, but never truly understood. They were not merely decorative. They were equations of reality, psychic circuits, wards of such power and antiquity that they made the air around them vibrate. At the center of the room was a single throne of obsidian, cold and unforgiving. This was to be my seat of transformation, my throne of agony. Waiting for me were the unseeing. 3 of the most ancient patriarchs of my house, so old, their bodies were little more than frames for the arcane life support systems humming beneath their robes. Their mundane eyes were gone, surgically removed centuries ago to prevent the sensory conflict that could drive a lesser navigator mad. In their place were smooth, tattooed patches of skin. Their third eyes were closed, but I could feel the immense slumbering pressure behind them, like sleeping gods in a mountain's heart. They did not speak. They did not offer words of encouragement or wisdom. They were simply there, facilitators of a brutal but necessary process, their faces impassive masks of wrinkled flesh. I walked towards the throne, my fine ceremonial robes feeling like a shroud. I had been taught my whole life that this was the greatest honor, the moment a scion of the house truly became a navigator. It was the culmination of my breeding, my training, my entire existence. My mind understood this as honor, but my body, with a primal wisdom my mind lacked, understood it as execution. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. A cold sweat traced its way down my spine. I was terrified not of failing but of succeeding. The moment I sat upon the throne, restraints of silvery metal snaked out, locking my limbs and head in place. One of the patriarchs approached, his movements slow and deliberate. He held a crystal phial filled with a shimmering, oily liquid. The psych-ethene oil. A single drop was placed on the center of my forehead. It was not cold. It was not hot. It was a sensation of utter nothingness, a void that began to spread across my skin, a null point where physical sensation ceased to exist. The unseeing took their positions around me, their hands raised. They began to chant a low, guttural drone that was not a language of words, but of pure, psychic intent. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly purple light. The very air grew thick, heavy, pressing in on me like water at the bottom of a crushing sea. The pressure was not on my body, but on my soul. They were using their own immense power to pry open the shell of my reality, to create a weak point, a fracture through which the impossible could flood in. Then came the pain. It is a fool's errand to describe it with a word as simple as pain. It was not a cut or a burn or a break. It was the deconstruction of self. It began at the point where the oil had touched my skin, a sensation like a white-hot nail being driven slowly, methodically through my skull. But the nail was not physical. It was a spike of pure psychic force, and it was not just piercing my bone, it was piercing my mind, my consciousness, my very identity. My scream was silent, trapped in my paralyzed throat, but in my mind it was a sound that could shatter planets. The feeling was of my skull being peeled apart from the inside of a section of my brain, being unwound and rewoven into something alien, something that did not belong in the ordered universe. A new sense was being born, not through evolution or gentle awakening, but through a violent, brutal caesarean of the psyche. The world of sight, sound, and touch dissolved into a meaningless synesthetic shriek. The hum of the resonators became the taste of rust. The purple glow of the glyphs became the feeling of spiders crawling on my skin. My own heartbeat became a blinding, strobing light behind my eyes. I was coming apart. My mind, my carefully constructed reality was being shredded, and in its place, a new, monstrous perception was being grafted. The patriarch's chant rose in pitch, a relentless psychic chisel, chipping away at the last foundations of my sanity. And then with a final soul-rending crack, something gave way. The pain did not stop. It changed. It became the backdrop to the horror. For in that moment the eye opened, and I saw. It was not a glimpse. It was an inundation. I was drowning in an ocean of raw, untamed creation. Before me, where the stone wall of the chamber should have been, was a roiling, infinite sea of energy. It was a kaleidoscope of colors that my brain had no names for, colors that seemed to twist and writhe and hate each other. Swirling currents of incandescent rage flowed past islands of crystalline despair. Nebulae of pure, ecstatic lust pulsed with a light that promised oblivion. There were sounds, but they did not enter my ears. They were mainlined directly into my soul. The gibbering chorus of a trillion mad thoughts, the echoes of every dying scream from every battle fought since the dawn of time, the seductive whisper of forbidden knowledge that promised to burn my mind to ash if I even dared to comprehend it. And I felt them. The inhabitants. At first, not as distinct beings, but as a presence, an awareness. The absolute crushing certainty that I was being observed by countless intelligences whose very existence was a blasphemy against logic and life. It was the feeling of a swimmer realizing the water around him is not empty, but thick with sharks, their hunger a palpable force against his skin. There were no distinct demons, no clawed things from myth. There was only the presence of the predators, the sheer, unimaginable weight of their attention, a pressure that threatened to crush my newborn perception before it could even draw its first breath. My innocence, the simple, blessed ignorance of a child who believes in a sane and ordered universe, was scoured from me in that instant. It was replaced by a terrible, irrevocable knowledge. The universe I knew was a lie. It was a thin, fragile shell of reality, and I was now staring, and would forever be staring, into the howling, limitless chaos that churned hungrily on the other side. The ritual was a success. I was born, and I was already damned. All the training, all the grim lessons in the silent halls of my spire were nothing but whispers against the hurricane of reality. My first posting was aboard the Stalwart Pilgrim, an ancient lunar-class cruiser whose hull bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. My place on this vessel was not on the bridge with the captain and his command staff. It was far above in the Navigator's sanctum, a lonely, isolated tower that pierced the ship's dorsal spine. It was a prison within a prison. No common crew member was permitted to approach. The air inside was recycled through filters laced with sacred incense, and the bulkheads were layered not only with adamantium, but with hexagrammic wards and plates of silver inscribed with litanies of passage. Ancient arcane technology hummed alongside crude, superstitious charms. Wires thick as a man's arm carrying potent energies ran next to skulls of former navigators, their third eye sockets plugged with prayer-etched gemstones. It was a place of profound silence, a pocket of tense meditative quiet before the plunge. I sat on my navigation throne, a less ornate but far more complex version of the one used in my opening, and felt the low thrum of the ship's plasma drives through the deck. For years I had practiced in psychic simulators, navigating holographic currents. But this was real. The lives of the 30,000 souls aboard this vessel were now cuffed to my perception, their continued existence dependent on my ability to stare into hell and not falter. The weight of it was a physical thing, far heavier than any gravity. The klaxon for warp transition was a dull, mournful chime that echoed only within my sanctum. On the bridge, the master of the ship would be giving the final commands. Down in the engine rooms, the tech priests would be chanting their binary prayers to the machine spirit of the warp drives. And then the universe lurched. It was not a feeling of acceleration or movement, but of fundamental wrongness. A shudder that passed not through the ship's structure, but through the structure of reality itself. The reassuring laws of physics thinned, stretched like worn fabric. And through the armored shutters of my sanctum, I did not need my mundane eyes to see the change. The familiar star-dusted black of the void was torn away like a veil, replaced by the roiling, impossible vista of the Empyrean. The Geller field flickered into full existence, bathing the ship in a shimmer of ethereal blue light. To the crew, it was a shield. To me, with my newly opened eye, it was a soap bubble in a maelstrom. It was a tiny, fragile sphere of Terran normal reality, adrift in an infinite ocean of madness. I could feel the pressure of the immaterium against it, a constant crushing weight, the psychic equivalent of a submersible at the bottom of the deepest, darkest trench. I could feel things brushing against the field's outer edge, things born of nightmare and disbelief, their insubstantial claws scraping, testing, seeking any flicker or flaw. It was a constant, terrifying assault, and the only thing holding it at bay was a fragile projection of technology and faith. The simulators had never taught me to feel this pressure, this ceaseless, hateful hunger from the other side. Then the true test began. It was my time to guide. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm the tremor in my soul, I closed my 2 physical eyes and opened the third. The raw, unfiltered chaos of the warp flooded my consciousness once more. But this time, I had a purpose. My training took over a core of rigid discipline in a sea of insanity. I was not meant to understand this place only to navigate it. I had to find the light, the Astronomicon. I searched the swirling madness filtering out the siren calls of laughing gods and the psychic residue of ancient atrocities. I pushed past the currents of molten rage and the eddies of sorrow, seeking a single specific signal in the cacophony. And then I found it. It was not the gentle, welcoming beacon of a lighthouse that the priests spoke of in their sermons. It was not a warm, golden glow of hope. What I saw was a psychic conflagration, a roaring, screaming pyre of unimaginable intensity, a pillar of light that was also a column of unending agony. I could feel it, the source of that light. The focused collective death scream of 10,000 psychers, their souls burned as fuel to cast this one desperate beacon across the hellscape of the warp. It was the Emperor's light, yes, but it was a light born of immense perpetual sacrifice. It was a shriek of defiance against the dark, a signal of humanity's indomitable will that was also a monument to its unending suffering. This was our safe harbor. This was our guiding star, a psychic flame fed by unending torment. And my task, my sacred, terrible duty was to steer our vessel by its horrific, glorious light. I had to embrace its pain to let its searing intensity be my compass and use it to plot a course through the backwaters of damnation, all while pretending for the sake of the captain below that I was simply reading a map. The journey had begun. My life as a navigator had truly started, and I already knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very marrow that I would never again know a moment of peace. A novice navigator fresh from his opening makes the mistake of thinking of the warp as a place. He conceives of it as a different kind of space, with currents and tides, reefs and storms. It is a useful metaphor, a necessary simplification to keep the mind from shattering. But after a century of voyaging, you learn the deeper truth. The warp is not a place. It is a state of being. It is the raw, bleeding underside of reality, the collective unconscious of every living, feeling creature in the galaxy made manifest. It is an ocean, yes, but it is an ocean of souls, and its currents are not driven by gravity or stellar winds, but by raw, untamed emotion. To sail the warp is to sail through a tempest of feeling. Every major event in the material realm, every surge of collective emotion creates a corresponding storm in the Empyrean. When a billion soldiers clash on a blasted world, their shared hatred, fear, and bloodlust do not simply dissipate upon death. They bleed through the veil, coalescing into a literal storm of rage in the warp, a maelstrom of psychic energy that can strand ships for centuries. I have guided vessels through the chilling calms of apathy that surround dead worlds, and I have fought to hold a course through cyclones of pure terror spawned by a hive world succumbing to plague. We do not navigate by stellar phenomena. We navigate by the emotional landscape of the galaxy. A navigator learns to taste the subtle differences in the psychic ether. He can sense the greasy, cloying slick of gluttony emanating from a decadent cardinal world, or the sharp, metallic tang of martial pride that surrounds a space marine fortress monastery. These are our landmarks, our treacherous, ever-shifting constellations. We are not merely observers of this emotional sea, we are swimmers within it. To plot a course is to submerge yourself in these tides, to let the sorrow of a forgotten massacre wash over you, to feel the fleeting warmth of a distant world's desperate hope, and to use these feelings to find your way. The horrors of the present are not the only dangers. The immaterium has no true concept of time. The past is not gone, it simply is. Intense psychic events leave scars, echoes that resonate for eternity. A navigator does not just see the warp as it is now. He is forced to witness the phantoms of what has been. There are regions of the Empyrean we call the Silent Screams, where the psychic death cries of the millions slaughtered during the Great Heresy still ring as clearly as the day they were uttered, a constant silent chorus of agony that can overload the senses and break an unprepared mind. I have navigated the Mandeville Point near the Iota Draconis system and felt the cold, meticulous pleasure of a long-dead Eldar Corsair as he tortured his victims millennia ago, the psychic residue of his cruelty so thick it feels like wading through oil. These are not memories or visions, they are active present sensations. The warp is a museum of every atrocity, every moment of intense passion, every dark desire, and we are its unwilling curators. We sail past the ghostly outlines of fleets destroyed in ancient wars, their psychic death agonies still playing out in a looping, spectral battle. We feel the echoes of betrayal, of sacrifice, of ambition, and of despair. It is a constant bombardment, a ceaseless reminder that the sins of the past are never washed away. They are simply absorbed into the fabric of this infernal dimension, waiting to be felt again and again by those like us who have no choice but to look. The emotional tides and psychic echoes of the warp are the environment, the weather of the Empyrean. But the sea is not empty. It is teeming with life, if one can use such a word for things born of unreality. Not all are the grand, terrible demons of legend. Most are simpler, more primal. Think of them as the fauna of the abyss, the scavengers and predators that swim in the psychic depths. As our vessel, our fragile bubble of reality moves through their domain, it shines like a lantern in the crushing dark, attracting their attention. With my warp eye I can sense them. Packs of psychic predators no more intelligent than sharks, drawn by the warmth of the living souls within the Geller field. I can feel their ephemeral forms scraping against the field, their minds a simple, singular broadcast of ravenous hunger. Sometimes, if the currents are thin, you can almost hear them, a high-frequency chittering at the very edge of psychic perception, the sound of incorporeal claws scratching at the barrier between worlds. They are a constant, unnerving presence, a reminder that even the empty spaces of the warp are filled with things that wish only to feed on our reality. Far more dangerous than these mindless hunters are the Whispers. The great powers, the dark gods of chaos, do not always send their legions. Their most potent weapon is often more subtle. They are aware of us, the Navigators. They know we are the keyholes through which they might peer into a vessel, the weak link in the chain of reality. And so they whisper. The whispers are not sound. They are ideas, temptations planted directly into the mind that is foolish enough to be open. They are perfectly tailored, exquisitely crafted to exploit the unique agonies of a navigator's existence. In the midst of a blinding warp storm, when the light of the Astronomicon is lost, and despair begins to set in, a voice like shattering crystal will offer a map. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, will present a path, a secret current that promises safety, and a quick journey asking only for a small price to trust the whisper instead of the Emperor's light. When the pain of perception becomes too much to bear, when every psychic scream is a needle in the soul, another voice, honeyed and melodic, will offer release. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, will promise an end to all suffering, a perfect, exquisite sensation that will drown out all the horror, requiring only that you give in, that you stop fighting and simply feel. There are whispers for every weakness. The fear of mutation and decay is answered by Nurgle's promise of a warm, painless, eternal stasis. The rage at your own helplessness is answered by Khorne's offer of the power to strike back, to become the predator instead of the prey. To listen is to be lost. To even consider the offer is to open a crack in your soul, and a crack is all they need. I have faced these temptations for centuries, but once I faced something more. It was during a voyage through the Ragged Helix, a notoriously unstable region. The ship's machine spirit was old, and the Gellerfield projector, despite the tech priest's constant blessings, chose a moment of particular turbulence to flicker. It was for less than a second, a single heartbeat. But in the warp, a heartbeat is an eternity. In that instant of vulnerability, something got in. It wasn't a whisper, it was a presence, and it manifested in the large observation chamber 2 decks below my sanctum. The screams of the crew over the Vox were incoherent, not just sounds of terror, but sounds of minds breaking. I focused my warp eye on the location, a thing I am trained never to do, and I saw it. To call it a creature is to grant it a logic it did not possess. Its form was an offense to geometry. It was a shifting, impossible shape, made of what I can only describe as solidified noise, its limbs stretching and retracting in defiance of trying to understand the color of a scream. Its very presence warped the reality of the chamber. Bulkheads warped and flowed like wax, and crewmen were not killed, but changed their bodies, twisted into parodies of life. I could feel its mind, a consciousness of pure, exultant hatred for the very concept of order and matter. It was a greater demon, a shard of its foul god's being. I could not fight it. I had no weapon to wield against such a thing. My only task, my only defense was to hold my ground, to keep my sanity tethered, to ignore the blasphemous truths it was screaming into my soul, and to keep the ship on its agonizingly precise course. I had to focus on the distant screaming light of the Astronomicon, using it as an anchor in a hurricane of madness, even as a piece of that madness was tearing my ship apart. The field eventually stabilized. The entity was banished, its borrowed physical form collapsing into nothing. But the chamber was lost, sealed off forever, its metal walls forever screaming with the psychic echo of that violation. I had saved the ship, but the image of that thing was burned behind my third eye, a scar that has never faded. The uninitiated believe we are merely pilots following a map through a difficult territory. They could not be more wrong. There is no map. To create a map, one requires constants, fixed points, predictable distances, a linear progression of time. The warp has none of these things. It actively despises them. The greatest and most unsettling challenge for a navigator is not the monsters, but the fundamental irrationality of the medium itself. Our greatest enemy is the insanity of its very nature. Time in the Empyrean is a liquid. It pools, it eddies, it flows backwards, it sometimes evaporates entirely. A voyage that by the ship's chronometers and the crew's own aging lasts for 3 weeks might see us emerge into real space only a few days after our departure. We call this a fortunate passage. More common is to arrive months, even years after we were expected. I have experienced voyages where a subjective month of travel has translated to a decade in the material universe, arriving at a world to find the governor who hired us long dead and his grandchildren in his place. The opposite is also true, and perhaps more disconcerting. We can arrive before we have even left a paradox that frays the sanity and creates temporal eddies that can have catastrophic consequences. As a navigator, one must detach oneself from the river of time that governs the rest of the universe. We exist in a state of temporal dislocation, our lives no longer a straight line from birth to death, but a tangled knot of subjective experience. It is a profound form of isolation to know that the galaxy you left may be irrevocably changed by the time you return, or that you may return to a time before your own memories. If time is fluid, then space is a fever dream. There are no straight lines in the immaterium. The concept of distance is meaningless. A world that is 1,000 light years away might be for a brief period psychically adjacent, a mere step through the veil. Another world in the same system might be an eternity away, separated by a storm of disbelief that makes it unreachable. We do not plot courses. We divine paths. We follow the psychic currents, the streams of relatively stable reality that flow through the madness. These currents are not natural phenomena. They are formed by the passage of great events, the echoes of strong emotions. We might follow the wake of a saint's pilgrimage, a path still glowing faintly with the residue of her faith. We might travel down a river of sorrow carved by the destruction of 1 billion lives. The safest routes are often those grooved into the fabric of the warp by millennia of travel, psychic highways worn smooth by countless passages. But even these are not guaranteed. A surge of galactic-scale fear can cause a trusted route to buckle and snap. A new war on a forgotten front can vomit a reef of hatred across a previously clear channel. What was a safe passage yesterday can be a direct course into the heart of a demon's domain tomorrow. Navigating the warp is not a science. It is a desperate intuitive art, a form of psychic cartography, where the map is alive, constantly rewriting itself according to the whims of gods and the dreams of sleeping trillions. The warp does not only scour the soul, it corrodes the vessel that contains it. Our bodies, for all the purity of our bloodlines, are still fundamentally creatures of the material universe. They are not meant to endure such prolonged, intimate exposure to the raw energies of the immaterium. The process is slow, insidious, a gradual erosion of the sacred human form. At first, the changes are subtle, almost imperceptible. They are even considered marks of station within the cloistered halls of the Navis Nobilite. Our skin takes on a pale, almost translucent quality, the result of a life spent under the artificial light of a sanctum, far from the honest rays of a yellow sun. Our bodies, already shaped by generations living in the low gravity of spires and void ships, become attenuated. Limbs grow long and thin, fingers delicate and spidery. The musculature atrophies, leaving a frail, almost skeletal frame. We are creatures of the mind, and our bodies reflect this withering away as the power of the third eye grows. To outsiders, we look like specters, ghostly and unnerving. To ourselves, these are the first acceptable signs of our noble sacrifice, the initial price the flesh pays for the power we wield. But the warp is a relentless creditor, and it always demands a higher price. Over the decades and centuries, as the accumulated energies of 1,000 voyages seep into our very marrow, more pronounced changes can begin to manifest. These are the mutations we do not speak of, the shameful deviations that are hidden beneath heavy robes and behind locked doors. These are not the celebrated marks of our kind, but the terrifying signs of corruption. I have known navigators whose skin developed a faint, shimmering, scaly texture, like that of a deep void fish. I have seen others whose teeth sharpened to unnatural points, or whose irises in their mundane eyes began to swirl with colors that did not belong in this reality. These are the unwanted gifts of the Empyrean, the physical manifestations of the chaos we witness. This is the source of the deepest paranoia within our houses. We constantly watch one another and ourselves for any sign of the taint. A hand that seems slightly too webbed, a shadow that falls at an unnatural angle. The patriarchs of the houses are ruthless in their pursuit of genetic purity. A navigator who begins to display such uncontrolled mutations is a liability, a potential gateway for greater corruption. They are quietly and swiftly retired. They vanish from the active rosters, sent to a comfortable seclusion from which no one ever returns. The fear of this quiet end keeps us vigilant and keeps our secrets buried deep. For those of us who live long enough, who serve for centuries, and manage to avoid the more overt corruptions, the final state is a different kind of prison. Our bodies simply begin to fail, worn thin by time and the constant stress of our duties. The energies of the warp that grant us our sight also consume us from within, accelerating our aging, even as our lifespans are artificially extended. The only solution is stasis. The elders of the houses, myself included, spend the vast majority of our time between voyages locked in stasis crypts. These are not comfortable rejuvenation chambers. They are cold, sterile coffins of plasteel and crystal, where time is held at bay and the decay of the flesh is arrested. We lie in a state of living death, our metabolic processes slowed to a near standstill, our minds in a dreamless, frozen quiet. It is the only way to preserve our abilities, to slow the inevitable slide into mutation and madness, to extend our usefulness to our house for another few decades. It is a half-life. We wake only to perform our terrible duty, to plunge once more into the hell of the warp, and then we return to the cold embrace of the crypt. We are relics, preserved tools kept sharp in a box of ice until we are needed. We trade a true life for a prolonged existence, a final bitter price for the power that has already cost us everything else. The body withers, it is true. It is a vessel of clay slowly cracking under an unbearable pressure. But flesh is resilient in its own way. It can be mended, sustained, placed in stasis. The mind, the soul, has no such respite. The true corruption, the deepest and most unforgivable price of our sight, is the slow, inexorable shearing away of our own humanity. The wounds to the soul are the ones that never heal. After you have seen the birth of a star from raw belief, after you have heard the whispers of a God who has existed for longer than time, after you have felt the psychic echo of a world being devoured whole, how can you return to the mundane? How can you sit at a table with a ship's captain and listen to his concerns about fuel consumption or crew morale, his worries, his hopes, his fears? They are the concerns of an infant babbling in a cradle, utterly oblivious to the wolves circling outside the nursery walls. A profound, unbridgeable chasm grows between a navigator and the rest of mankind. We guide them, we protect them, but we are no longer one of them. Their reality seems like a fragile, charming stage play. We see the backstage, the ropes and pulleys and the ravenous things hiding in the shadows, waiting for the curtain to fall. This disconnection is not born of arrogance or contempt. It is a deep, sorrowful alienation. We are custodians of a truth so terrible that to speak it would be to destroy the very minds we are sworn to protect. And so we remain silent, aloof, encased in our lonely spires, the isolation of our station mirroring the isolation of our knowledge. There is no rest. This is a simple, absolute truth of our existence. The common man, even a soldier on a bloody battlefield, can find solace in sleep. He can close his eyes and for a few hours find a measure of peace in the darkness of unconsciousness. We are denied this mercy. When I close my two mundane eyes, the third remains open. It cannot be closed. Sleep is not a sanctuary. It is merely an uncontrolled voyage. When my conscious mind relinquishes its grip, my soul is left to drift untethered on the currents of the warp. My dreams are not the gentle fantasies or anxieties of a mortal. They are a chaotic, terrifying slideshow of the Empyrean's horrors, unfiltered by discipline or purpose. I am dragged through nebulae of forgotten fears. I listen to the soliloquies of mad entities. I witness births and deaths of concepts that have no place in a sane mind. I am haunted relentlessly by everything I have ever seen. The faces of demons, the geometry of impossible places, the sound of a billion souls crying out in unison. I often wake not with a scream on my lips, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest can cure. Every sleep is a fresh trauma, a new layer of horror applied to the psyche. We are ever watchful, our gaze forever fixed upon the abyss, whether we are awake or asleep. Faced with this constant, unrelenting assault on the senses and the soul, how does one maintain a semblance of sanity? We fracture. We develop mechanisms, rituals, and dependencies to anchor ourselves to the fading shores of reality. Each navigator finds their own crutch. Some descend into obsessive, rigid ritual. They will spend hours arranging and rearranging trinkets in their sanctum, finding a desperate comfort in imposing a small, meaningless order on their immediate environment. Others turn to the flesh. They might practice severe self-mortification, using the sharp, clean reality of physical pain to drown out the psychic cacophony. The sting of the lash is a real, understandable sensation in a way that the whispers of Tzinch are not. Conversely, some plunge into the opposite extreme, indulging in every luxury, every decadent sensation the material universe can offer. They surround themselves with exotic foods, intoxicating drugs, and sensory experiences of every kind, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything that is real and tangible, to remind themselves that the world of matter still exists. For many, including myself for a time, The only solace comes from potent, carefully crafted psychoactive narcotics distilled by the finest apothecaries of our houses. They do not silence the third eye, nothing can do that, but they can sometimes dull its edges, sanding down the sharpest points of the horror into a more manageable, dreamlike haze. We are all broken. We are all mad by any rational standard. Our entire existence is a carefully managed psychosis, a balancing act on the knife's edge between duty and damnation, using whatever desperate, pathetic tools we can find to keep from falling. The obvious threats of the warp, the raging storms and the clawed monstrosities are in their own way a comfort. They are honest in their malice. You know what they are and what they want. But the Empyrean has subtler, crueler traps for the unwary. The most dangerous of all is not the storm, but the calm. I recall one voyage many centuries ago where we had been navigating a particularly violent stretch of the Empyrean. For weeks it was a constant battle, a psychic brawl to keep the ship intact. Then suddenly it ended. We passed through a psychic wall and entered a region of profound, absolute tranquility. The ceaseless screaming that is the background radiation of the warp faded to a gentle hum. The pressure against the Geller field vanished. The colors of the immaterium softened from their usual malevolent hues into a soothing palette of deep blues and gentle violets. The journey became effortless. The ship sailed on a placid, silent sea. The tension that had been coiled in my gut for my entire life began for the first time to unspool. It felt peaceful, and that was the most terrifying sensation of all. This was not an empty peace. The calm began to fill with things, not horrors but wonders. It reached into my mind, rummaging through the wreckage of my memories and my long-suppressed desires, and it began to project them for me. I caught the scent of night-blooming jessamine from the gardens of my house on Terra, a scent I had not experienced since I was a child before my opening. I heard the faint, ghostly laughter of a young woman I had once known, a brief, impossible friendship from my youth before she was married off to another house, and I was committed to my duty. The vision was not just for me. The captain on the bridge, a stoic and battle-hardened man, reported seeing a vision of his home world, not the polluted hive he had left, but a pristine green world of myth. The temptation was not a demand or a bargain. It was a gentle invitation. Stay. The whisper was not from a specific entity, but from the very fabric of this false reality. Why hurry? Why return to a galaxy of war and pain? Here there is peace. Here there is beauty. All you must do is rest. Let go of the helm. Stay. It was the subtlest of poisons, a lure crafted by a power that understands the nature of despair, perhaps Tzeentch offering a beautiful lie, or Slaanesh a perfect, painless sensation. It showed me everything my life was not everything I had sacrificed. It offered me hope, and in the warp hope is the most dangerous contraband of all. For a moment, a single terrifying moment, I allowed myself to believe it. I felt the muscles in my soul tense for centuries begin to relax. The vision of the woman from my youth smiled at me, a vision of a life I could have had, a life of simple human connection. And in that moment of weakness, I felt the ship begin to drift from the light of the Astronomicon. It was a subtle, gentle deviation, like a drowsy pilot letting his hand slip from the controls. That was the alarm. The sensation of straying from that beacon of agony, our one true anchor, snapped me back from the brink. And the awakening was a pain unlike any other. I had to actively, consciously, with the full force of my will, shatter the illusion. I had to look at the face of my long-lost friend and declare her a lie. I had to smell the gardens of my childhood and recognize them as poison. I had to take the peace and beauty that was being offered to me and crush it within my own mind. The effort was monumental, a self-inflicted act of immense psychological violence. To turn your back on paradise to choose the screaming agony of reality, over a beautiful, perfect lie. That act breaks something inside you. It kills the last vestiges of hope. The pain of it was far worse than facing the demon in the observation chamber, for that was an external enemy. This was a battle against my own heart. I seized psychic control, wrestled the ship back onto its tortuous path, and pierced the veil of calm, plunging us back into the familiar, shrieking chaos of the true warp. The beautiful vision vanished and the screams returned. I was safe. I was once again in hell. There is one fear that sits above all others in the heart of a navigator. It is a primal, absolute terror that makes the threat of demons and the slow corrosion of the flesh seem like minor discomforts. It is the fear of the light failing. The Astronomicon, that screaming beacon of agony, is our compass, our anchor, our only fixed point in an ocean of madness. To lose its light is to be rendered utterly hopelessly blind in the heart of the storm. And on a voyage to the eastern fringe through the turbulent Kali sector, that ultimate fear became a reality. A warp storm of unprecedented violence descended upon us, a true maelstrom of the soul. It was not born of a single war or a planetary disaster. It felt as if 1 billion worlds were screaming in unison. The Empyrean churned into a black psychic sludge, thick with rage and despair. And through that impenetrable curtain of madness, the light of the Astronomicon for the first time in my 5 centuries of service was extinguished. One moment it was there, a distant, defiant shriek. The next there was nothing. Only the storm. I was blind. The ship was adrift in hell without a guide. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The ship, no longer guided by my will, began to buck and drift on the insane currents. On the bridge, they would only feel the turbulence see the navigation runes flicker to red. In my sanctum, I felt the truth. The fragile bubble of the Gela field was being stretched and pummeled, no longer slipping through the currents, but being battered by them. The psychic pressure was immense. But worse than that was the wave of pure, undiluted terror that washed over me from the 30,000 souls aboard the stalwart Pilgrim. Their collective fear was a physical force, a high-pitched psychic scream that threatened to overwhelm my own senses. They did not know the specifics, but they knew something was terribly wrong. They could feel the ship's wrongness, its lostness. The vox link to the captain crackled to life. His voice, usually a pillar of calm command, was strained tight with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. "Navigator," he asked, the words that hanging in the silence of my sanctum report. "What is your status?" How could I answer him? How could I tell him that our only map had just been burned, that our only sun had gone out, that we were now nothing more than a piece of driftwood in a hurricane with no shore? The pressure of their dependence, their absolute reliance on my cursed sight, was a weight that could crush stars. We could not simply stay put. To remain adrift in a storm of this magnitude was to be slowly torn apart, our Gela field eroded by the constant psychic friction until the horrors outside could flood in. Our only choice was the ultimate act of desperation for a navigator, a blind transition. Not a full jump into the warp, but a short, desperate plunge, an act of faith in a universe that punishes faith. I sealed my sanctum, blocking out the captain's frantic calls and the crew's rising panic. I had to focus. I had no light to guide me, so I had to rely on the only other thing I had: centuries of experience. I had to feel the currents, taste the psychic winds, and divine a path not with sight, but with pure, terrified instinct. It was like being a blind man in a stampede, trying to guess which way to run. I felt for a current that was slightly less malevolent, a stream in the torrent that felt less like pure hatred and more like simple, mindless rage. I pointed our bow towards it, a direction with no name and no destination, and gave the psychic command to the helm. It was the ultimate gamble, a single roll of the dice, with the souls of every man and woman on that ship as the stake. For a few agonizing seconds, the ship plunged deeper into the madness, and I had no idea if I had just saved us or damned us all to an oblivion far worse than death. My gamble failed. We did not emerge from the storm. We fell through it. We plunged into a depth of the Empyrean I had only read about in the most forbidden texts, a place where the metaphor of an ocean gives way to the reality of a thinking, malignant hell. The ship groaned a sound not of metal stress but of reality strain. The laws of causality were not just bent here. They were broken, discarded playthings of a monstrous will. The air in my sanctum grew thick, taking on the coppery taste of old blood and the scent of ozone and fear. Through my third eye I saw the very substance of the warp change. It was no longer a chaotic sea of random emotion. It was a realm of horrifying order, a domain shaped by a singular monolithic consciousness of hate and violence. The currents here were not random. They flowed with martial purpose, and the entire realm pulsed in time with a single titanic heartbeat. We had fallen into the domain of the blood god. The Geller field, which had held for so long against the chaotic siege of the outer warp, could not withstand the directed, focused pressure of this place. It did not flicker and die. It shattered. It burst like a soap bubble, and in that instant hell flooded the stalwart pilgrim. What followed was not a battle. A battle implies a contest, a struggle between two sides. This was a harvest. From my isolated throne, I was a helpless psychic witness to the ship's final screaming moments. I felt the minds of the 30,000 souls aboard as they were snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. I felt the armsmen in the corridors, their faith and their laser guns utterly useless as the bulkheads around them flowed like liquid and the very air they breathed turned to razor-sharp glass. I heard the psychic shriek of the ship's machine spirit as its logical core was violated by impossible geometries. It was a symphony of annihilation, a crescendo of terror, madness, and slaughter. Physics died. Men and women were not just killed. They were unmade, their bodies and souls rendered down into raw material for the laughing things that now swarmed the decks. There was no glory, no honor, only a frantic, chaotic, and mercifully brief end. Trapped at the very center of the carnage, a storm of psychic death raging all around me, I was paradoxically ignored. The predators were focused on the simpler, more satisfying prey. But their master, the power that reigned over this domain, was not so dismissive. As the last lights on my console died, and the last human mind aboard the ship screamed its last, a presence turned its attention to me. It was not a whisper. It was a psychic gaze of infinite burning pressure. My mind, my very soul, was pinned like an insect under the focus of a star. I did not see a creature of horn and claw. I saw the concept of battle itself. I was flooded with a perfect, terrible understanding of every act of violence ever committed from the first time a microbe devoured another to the heat death of the universe. I understood rage not as an emotion, but as a fundamental cosmic constant more real than gravity. I saw a throne built not of brass, but of the very idea of dominion sitting atop a mountain of conceptual skulls. My mind, the mind of a mortal man, was stretched to encompass a truth it was never meant to hold. It was a forced enlightenment, a revelation of such magnitude and horror that it did not just break my sanity. It incinerated it, leaving behind nothing but the smoking, blackened ash of understanding. In that moment, I, who had spent centuries looking into hell, finally saw the eye of the devil staring back. And I knew with a clarity that was the very definition of madness that we were not just lost in his domain. We were and always had been nothing more than a fleeting dream in his mind. My mind was broken, but my body, through some cosmic cruelty, survived. The ship, or what was left of it, eventually drifted out of that hell realm, a dead hulk of metal screaming with the ghosts of its crew. I was found rescued, brought back to the Spire on Terra. But the navigator who had left on that voyage never returned. I am what was left over. In the long, silent years since confined to this sanctum, this life-sustaining tomb, I have had an eternity to contemplate the ends that await my kind. For a navigator, there is no peaceful retirement. There is no quiet death in a warm bed surrounded by loved ones. There are only brutal fates, each a unique flavor of damnation. For some, the end comes as a slow, quiet freezing. After centuries of peering into the Empyrean, the warp eye simply gives out. It is not a gentle closing. It calcifies. The delicate psychic organ hardens, turning to a crystal-like substance within the skull, forever sealing the window to the warp. We call it the petrification. The navigator's sight is gone, their usefulness to their house concluded. But they do not die. They become living statues, their minds locked in an eternal looping replay of their last and most terrible visions. They sit motionless in their chambers, their mundane eyes wide and unseeing, their bodies sustained by medici servitors, but their consciousness is lost forever, trapped in a nightmare from which they can never awaken. They are honored as heroes who have given their all, but they are in truth the most tragic of monuments, a testament to a mind burned out by horrors beyond endurance. A far darker path awaits those who do not break, but bend. Those who in a moment of ultimate despair or seductive temptation finally listen to the whispers in the dark. These are the fallen. They are the navigators who, unable to bear their burden any longer, choose to embrace the promises of the Chaos Gods. They accept the offer of knowledge of power of an end to pain. They become the ultimate traitors. A fallen navigator is a weapon of unimaginable terror, for they do not just guide a ship to a destination. They can open a direct gateway to the warp. They will intentionally misguide their vessel, steering it not to a safe harbor, but to a sacrificial altar in a demon world. They will use their sight to pinpoint weaknesses in reality, to aid the incursions of chaos into the material universe. They are reviled, hunted by their own houses with a singular merciless fury, for they represent our greatest fear, that the power we wield can be turned, that the warden of the prison can willingly open the gates. Their end is an eternity of servitude, their souls forfeit, their bodies twisted into monstrous new forms, their damnation absolute. Then there is the third fate, the one our grim kind has come to regard as the most merciful, the luckiest of ends. It is the path of simple, utter annihilation. It happens from time to time during a particularly violent voyage. A navigator, straining their sight to its absolute limit, simply disappears. One moment they are on their throne, locked in a psychic battle with the storm. The next, there is nothing. An empty chair, a faint, fading echo of a psychic scream that lingers for a moment before being swallowed by the warp's cacophony. Their soul has been utterly and completely consumed, torn apart, and devoured by the raw energies of the Empyrean. There is no afterlife, no servitude, no tormented existence as a living statue. There is only oblivion, annihilation, a final clean erasure from existence. To be unmade, to cease to be in every conceivable sense, is the greatest blessing a navigator can hope for. It is a swift, final end to the pain, a release from the burden of sight. That this is our fondest hope speaks volumes about the truth of our existence. Even in death, there is no true escape from our function. The curse of our bloodline has a half-life that extends beyond the grave. When a navigator's body finally fails, whether through misadventure, violence, or simple decay in a stasis crypt, the third eye does not always die with it. Often it retains a measure of its terrible power, a residual connection to the immaterium. These dead eyes, harvested from the skulls of our most potent ancestors, become potent and deeply cursed relics. They are enshrined in our family vaults, used as focusing tools for arcane rituals, or studied by the psych theorists of our houses in a vain attempt to better understand our condition. But they are also hunted. The agents of the holy ordos of the Inquisition seek them believing they can be turned into weapons against the demonic. Heretics and chaos cults crave them, wishing to unlock their secrets and peer into the minds of their gods. The very thing that defined us in life becomes a coveted, dangerous object after our death, a source of conflict and obsession. Our legacy is not one of peace, but a continuation of the horror, a cursed piece of ourselves left to poison the galaxy long after we are gone. And the great grinding machine of the Imperium continues heedless of the cost. The bloodline must be preserved. The star lanes must remain open. For every navigator who is petrified, falls, or is consumed by the void, another must be prepared to take their place. From my high window in this spire, I sometimes see them, the young ones, the scions of the house children with pale skin and old eyes walking silently through the gardens. They are taught the same stories. I was the myths of honor and the catechisms of duty. They are praised for their genetic purity and reminded of the glorious destiny that awaits them. I see the mixture of pride and fear in their young faces as they are led towards the ritual chambers, utterly unaware of the truth that lies in wait. They do not know that their gift is a wound, their privilege a death sentence. They are the next generation of sacrifices bred and raised to be fed into the maw of the warp. The cycle is unbroken. The curse is passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, a legacy of unending horror disguised as nobility. We are a dynasty built on the wreckage of our own souls, and the foundations are forever being replenished. And so I sit here in the cold silence of my sanctum, a ghost in a machine of life support. The memories, the horrors, the ceaseless visions, they are my only companions. The vox is silent. The servants do not enter unless summoned. There is only the low hum of the stasis field generators and the faint psychic echo of the screaming cosmos that only I can hear. For centuries I have been asked in hushed and fearful tones by the few high-ranking mortals who dared to speak plainly. What is the greatest horror of the warp? They expect tales of the blood god's legions, of the seductive plagues, of the grandfather of the impossible schemes of the architect of fate. They expect stories of fanged mouths and clawed hands of the monsters that haunt the Imperium's nightmares. But they are wrong. The demons, the storms, the impossible landscapes, they are merely the symptoms. They are the waves on the surface of the ocean. The true horror, the ultimate soul-annihilating truth that is revealed to every navigator who truly sees, is not the nature of the warp. It is the nature of our reality. It is the profound, crushing, and absolute realization of humanity's true place in the universe. The Imperium of Man, in all its supposed glory, is a lie. We tell ourselves we are a galaxy-spanning empire, a billion worlds united under the glorious banner of the God Emperor. We believe we are the inheritors of the cosmos, a bastion of order and light in a dark and hostile universe. But from my vantage point, with an eye that sees the truth of things, I can tell you what we truly are. We are a handful of shipwreck survivors clinging to a single rotting raft in the middle of an infinite and eternally tempestuous ocean. We are not masters of the stars. We are prisoners born into a galactic prison, desperately piling stones onto the crumbling walls, knowing in the deepest parts of our being that the tide is rising and the walls will not hold. Every ship I have ever guided, from the mightiest battleship to the humblest freighter, is not a vessel of conquest. It is a prison cell moving from one part of the larger prison to another. The Geller field is not a shield. It is a prayer against the inevitable, the thinnest of membranes separating a handful of souls from an eternity of damnation. The trillions of citizens who toil in the hives and pray in the cathedrals live in a state of blissful ignorance that is the only thing preserving their sanity. Their faith, their belief in the Emperor's divinity, and humanity's manifest destiny is the wall that separates them from the truth. And we, the navigators, are the wardens who must stand on that wall looking out into the storm, and we are cursed to see that the storm is everything and the wall is nothing. That light the Astronomicon, the very soul of the Emperor, made manifest, it is not the conquering fire of a triumphant god. It is not a beacon of hope spreading outwards to reclaim the galaxy. It is a candle, a single flickering candle in the heart of a cosmic hurricane that stretches for eternity in all directions. It is the light of a dying campfire surrounded by a darkness filled with circling, starving wolves. We steer by its light, not because it is a guide to glory, but because it is the only thing that reminds us that our raft has not yet been swallowed by the waves. Its light is not a promise of victory. It is the defiant scream of the damned, the last desperate act of a dying man shaking his fist at the abyss. It is a monument to our own desperation. This is the ultimate horror. Not that there are monsters, but that the monsters are the norm. The true terror is the realization that the chaos, the madness, the raw, predatory hunger of the warp is the default state of the universe. It is our small, fragile pocket of order, logic, and sanity that is the aberration. We are the fleeting, insignificant dream in the mind of a sleeping, mad god. And one day, inevitably, that god will awaken. So the silence in my sanctum is not one of peace. It is not the quiet of a life's work completed or of a rest well earned. It is the silence of acceptance. The quiet that comes after the final scream when you have seen the truth and you know there is nothing left to say. There is no hope of victory. There is no possibility of escape. There is only the duty, the watching, the navigating from one crumbling shore to the next, for as long as the candle remains lit. I am a navigator. My name is forgotten. My house will endure for a time. But I have stared into the abyss. I have seen the truth of its depths, and the abyss has stared back, and in its eye I saw our reflection. Everything is already lost. Everything has always been lost. We were simply born too late to see the beginning, and we will die too soon to see the end. There is only the voyage and the echoes from the deep. And now for me, at long last, there is only silence.